insane asylum is an infamous American cultural icon, most often associated with foreboding, inhumanity, and suffering. But there is more to this story, a story that can be revealed by asking the four following questions. Why were they founded? How did they operate? Why did they fall out of favor? And what legacy did they leave behind? Today, state schools and hospitals are all but extinct, an extinction that was brought on by miraculous advancements in medicine and positive changes in the perception of those who are mentally ill and developmentally disabled. Despite this, these institutions have stayed alive through stories told by individuals, literature, film, and even video games. Perhaps a relative once worked at a state hospital as an attendant, or a family member or friend was once a patient. Perhaps you have read One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest or Girl Interrupted, or seen the movie adaptations of both. Perhaps you saw one of the numerous TV exposés that revealed the truly horrific conditions of state schools in the 1970s. Perhaps you have explored an abandoned institution, or heard spooky stories from someone who has. But however much you think you know about the history and legacy of state psychiatric institutions, you do not know it all. A note on language. As we have strived to better understand mental health and developmental disability, the terminology used to refer to these conditions and those who experience them have evolved. Words such as insane and lunatic were once commonly used to refer to mentally ill individuals. In the early 1900s, terms such as idiot and feeble-minded were considered the proper and respectful terms for those with developmental disabilities. Later, retarded was used in a similar manner. These terms are at best simply outdated and at worst deeply offensive. In this documentary, these words are used sparingly, only when referring to a time period in which they were acceptable. Part 1. Moral Treatment. To properly tell the story of institutions, we start not in the United States, but in 18th century France. In that time, mental illness was seen as a disease, similar to other ailments in that it was contracted physically. Methods such as bleeding, corporal punishment, and confinement by chains were used to treat mental health problems. Indeed, treatment for those considered mad was so tumultuous that London's Bethlehem Hospital, commonly referred to as Bedlam Hospital, became synonymous with chaos and disorder. In 1792, Frenchman Philippe Pinel was given control of the Bicestre Asylum located in Paris. The practices employed at the institution were, simply put, detrimental to the well-being of the patients there. Pinel proceeded to literally unchain 53 of the asylum's patients. He stated that using chains to confine these people was inhumane and did not successfully treat mental illness. Pinel decided that therapy focused on psychology would be more successful, an idea that would become known as moral treatment. In this style of treatment, patients were to be kept in an orderly institution with a rigorous schedule. It was thought that such a regimen would force patients to internalize the values of society and regain their reason. Pinel stated that, "One of the major principles of the psychologic management of the insane is to break their will in a skillfully timed manner without causing wounds or imposing hard labor. Rather, a formidable show of terror should convince them that they are not free to pursue their impetuous willfulness and that their own choice is to submit." Meanwhile, in England, a Quaker named William Tuke independently came to a very similar conclusion. He drove the campaign to open the York Retreat, his actions coming to fruition in 1796. It was so named to convey that the hospital would be a refuge for the unhappy. Tuke and the leadership of the retreat were wary of conventional treatments of insanity, and thus tried to use them as little as possible. Tuke echoed Pinel's beliefs, saying,
"There is much analogy between the judicious treatment of children and that of insane persons. Hence the principle of fear, when moderately and judiciously excited, has a salutary effect."
Dr. Thomas Story Kirkbride, who became very important later in the history of psychiatry, reflected upon the achievements of both Pinel and Tuke.
By a singular coincidence, without any knowledge of each other's movement, were at the same time, in different kingdoms, engaged in the same noble work of discarding time-honored prejudices and abuses and giving to the world a code of principles for the moral treatment of insanity.
In 1813, the Asylum for the Relief of Persons Deprived of the Use of Their Reason was founded, one of the first such institutions in the United States. The first wave of insane asylums founded in the United States were private enterprises. Among them were the Charlestown Asylum in Massachusetts, soon renamed to the McLean Asylum, the Bloomingdale Asylum in New York, and the Hartford Retreat in Connecticut. At these hospitals, there was an effort to serve the entirety of the community, rather than just those who could afford treatment. However, this was short-lived. The Charlestown Asylum, founded at the same time as the Massachusetts General Hospital, never admitted patients who could not pay for their own stays. The Hartford and Bloomingdale hospitals originally had a significant number of charity cases, but once public hospitals were founded in the mid to late 1800s, these patients disappeared from private institutions. The Friends Hospital was only ever open to Quakers in these early years, as was the York Retreat. As such, the pauper insane were left to suffer in poorhouses, almshouses, and prisons. Part 2. Noble Beginnings, Harsh Realities. By the 1820s, Americans were expecting more out of their government. Society was rapidly changing, with the first industrial revolution starting to catch steam in the Northeast and increasing numbers of immigrants arriving at the United States' shores. Many recognized that there needed to be formal governmental mechanisms put into place to combat such ills as poverty, crime, and disease. Prisons, poorhouses, and almshouses were the first such mechanisms to be established, with the stated purpose of taking vagrants and criminals off the streets. States in the Northeast, among them Massachusetts, New York, and Pennsylvania, led the charge. Committees in those states found that pauperism, a state of extreme poverty or destitution, was an evil that was best remedied by a creation of a public system of workhouses and strict discipline. Unfortunately, mentally ill people were rounded up with the poor and criminal and not given the careful treatment they deserved. In 1825, the Reverend Louis Dwight founded the Boston Prison Discipline Society to spread awareness of the inhumane conditions of prisons. He was a part of the American Bible Society, and as a part of this role he gave out Bibles to inmates. He was disgusted by the conditions he saw in prisons, especially so when it came to insane inmates. Dwight once encountered an insane inmate who had left his room only twice in 10 years. His concerns led to many ideas on how to best remedy the situation, but it was the work of Horace Mann that initiated the founding of Massachusetts' first public psychiatric facility. Most famous for championing public education, Horace Mann was also instrumental in the founding of Worcester Hospital. In a speech to the Massachusetts legislature in 1830, Mann said that,
"While we delay, they suffer. Whatever they endure which we can prevent is virtually afflicted by our own hands. It is now in the power of the members of this House to become protectors to the wretched and benefactors to the miserable."
The Worcester Hospital opened in 1833, with its patient population made up of poor or middle-class people. This took the burden off of McLean Hospital to care for such cases. Indeed, McLean became home to an improved class of sufferers, according to the hospital's superintendent at the time. The number of patients at Worcester rose quickly from 107 at its opening to 359 13 years later. In that time, the reported rate of patients cured was between 82 and 91%. From the founding of Worcester Hospital in 1833 to 1849, a span of 16 years, Maine, New Hampshire, New York, New Jersey, Indiana, Tennessee, Georgia, and Louisiana all opened public asylums. Almost from the outset, these institutions were overcrowded, and as such they quickly expanded their facilities. Worcester Hospital originally had capacity for 120 patients, and nearly tripled in size by 1846. At least 10 states decided to found additional hospitals to counteract overcrowding by 1875. Overcrowding was not the only issue these institutions faced, however. Worcester Hospital was located in the geographic center of the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, far from the state's main population center of Boston. This reflected a belief that a centrally situated hospital would provide equal access to said institution by all the citizens of the state, but this did not work in practice. In actuality, areas farther away from the hospital were not adequately covered. Faced with this situation, bigger cities founded their own asylums, separate from the state system. The most infamous example was the New York City Lunatic Asylum, originally opened in 1825. Located on Blackwell's Island, this hospital was meant to care for the city's poor insane. However, the hospital employed cruel prisoners as attendants and was plagued with overcrowding. Despite the clear need for a new, larger hospital within the New York City metropolitan area, New York State's first public hospital, opened in 1843, was constructed far away in Utica. Likewise, the prevailing theories around care within institutions were deeply flawed when applied in practice. Hospitals, in addition to being overcrowded, were often understaffed. It was originally hoped that institutions would provide personal care to patients and the superintendent would be able to personally oversee treatment. However, in practice, psychiatric hospitals quickly grew too big to have this kind of one-on-one care. Because of this, nurses and administrative staff were more distant from their patients. Thus, psychiatric hospitals evolved into warehouses for the mentally ill rather than a place for treatment. By the late 1840s and into the 1850s, there was a renewed push to establish more state hospitals. This movement was spearheaded in large part by social activist Dorothea Dix and psychiatrist Dr. Thomas Story Kirkbride. In 1843, Dix wrote her first petition to the Massachusetts legislature to support the expansion of Worcester Hospital.
I come to place before the legislature of Massachusetts the condition of the miserable, the desolate, the outcast. I come as the advocate of helpless, forgotten, insane, idiotic men and women, of beings sunk to condition from which the most unconcerned would start with real horror.
This effort was a success, and Dix went on to write many more speeches to be delivered in front of legislatures around the country. The details in these petitions were often gruesome, but that made them all the more effective.
I tell what I have seen, painful and shocking as the details often are, that from them you may feel more deeply the imperative obligation which lies upon you to prevent the possibility of a repetition or continuance of such outrages upon humanity.
Dix appealed to the humanity of senators and representatives, detailing the suffering of the mentally ill she herself witnessed. She saw herself as a friend to the insane, although she did often downplay their own individuality.
I am the voice of the maniac whose piercing cries from the dreary dungeons of your jails penetrate not your halls of legislation. I am the revelation of hundreds of wailing, suffering creatures hidden in your private dwellings and in pens and cabins, shut out, cut off from all healing influences, from all mind-restoring cares.
Dix not only continually advocated for the construction or expansion of asylums, but she was also frequently consulted by psychiatrists and hospital superintendents. By the time of her death in 1887, Dix had been instrumental in the opening or renovation of over 30 psychiatric hospitals in the United States and overseas. Dix was not the only person advocating for the construction of more institutions. In 1854, Dr. Thomas Story Kirkbride, the superintendent of the Pennsylvania Hospital for the Insane, published a groundbreaking book on the subject of psychiatric hospitals. It was titled On the Construction, Organization, and General Arrangements of Hospitals for the Insane, with some remarks on insanity and its treatment. Evidently, this burdensome title did not dilute the book's popularity, as a second expanded edition was published in 1880. General Arrangements, as the book is hereafter referred to as, was a guidebook on Kirkbride's vision of how to best design and administer a psychiatric hospital. He proposed a universal layout for hospitals for the insane, with a central administration building at the front and wings projecting off each side, stepping back with each additional wing. Kirkbride suggested that the most well-behaved and stable patients should be housed closest to the central building, and the more extreme patients to be held in the outermost wings. Kirkbride saw mental illness as
a disease from which no age, sex, class, or profession in life can claim exemption, and that nowhere does it fail to make itself recognized as the great leveler of all the artificial distinctions of society.
In other words, insanity was something that did not discriminate, and that all members of society were equally susceptible to it. Kirkbride held that
insanity, when uncomplicated, properly, and promptly treated, and having this treatment duly persevered in, may be regarded as curable as most other serious diseases.
As such, formal institutions laid out on a standardized plan would be the best option for those suffering from mental illness. A key point in the Kirkbride plan was that the site of the hospital should be located in the country, surrounded by natural serenity but not too far away from a town of considerable size, good roads, and railway access. The hospital, according to the second edition of General Arrangements, should have an upper limit of 250 patients and be no taller than 3 stories. Kirkbride knew that larger hospitals were detrimental to mental health care.
There is always more difficulty in superintending details in a large hospital. There are more sources of waste and loss. Improvements are apt to be relatively more costly, and the patients will be less comfortable.
Hospitals under the Kirkbride plan were to be well ventilated, built of fireproof material, have doors about 6 feet 8 inches by 2 feet 8 inches, and have workspaces for patients. This latter provision echoes the belief that occupational therapy would be greatly beneficial to psychiatric patients. Additionally, hospitals were to be as self-sufficient as possible. Such was the case at Danvers State Hospital in Massachusetts. Danvers had silos, barns, and cottages, with the farm producing eggs, milk, beef, poultry, pork, hay, and onions. Other state hospitals and later state schools had very similar facilities. Interestingly, Kirkbride includes a chapter entitled Importance of a Correct Nomenclature. In this section, he states that
it seems especially desirable that this malady, now so much better appreciated by the whole civilized world than formerly, should have every advantage that can result from a correct nomenclature.
In plain terms, Kirkbride argues that the usage of politically correct terminology when referring to hospitals or their occupants is beneficial. Listing out the terms lunacy and lunatic, terms having originated from the belief that mental illness was somehow tied to the moon, Kirkbride says that,
as applied to individuals, they have become offensive for their old associations.
Kirkbride also takes aim at the term asylum, which was commonly used in Kirkbride's time and continues to be used today. He states that custom alone has led to the retention of the phrase, and that it should be no longer used in an official manner. Kirkbride's book was a huge success, and coupled with the drive for the establishment of more public institutions, it had an outsized effect. The first hospital to be built according to the Kirkbride plan was Trenton State Hospital, which was founded directly because of Dorothea Dix's activism. Kirkbride buildings were soon popping up all over the country and even outside the United States. Well-known examples of Kirkbride asylums include St. Elizabeth's Hospital in Washington, D.C., Bryce Hospital in Alabama, Buffalo State Hospital in New York, Oregon State Hospital, and the Danvers, Worcester, and Northampton State Hospitals in Massachusetts. Despite Kirkbride's objections to hospitals caring for more than 250 people at a time, many hospitals opened with a higher capacity. Danvers State Hospital, originally named the State Lunatic Hospital at Danvers, had an original capacity of 305 patients. Much has been made about the fact that the hospital was built on the site of the house of John Hawthorne, who was chief examiner in the Salem witch trials of the 1690s. John Hawthorne was also great-great-grandfather to famous author Nathaniel Hawthorne, who slightly changed the spelling of his last name to avoid association with his elder, who never showed remorse for his actions in the trials. The front door knocker from John Hawthorne's house was saved and later installed on the female nurse's cottage at the state hospital. The construction of Danvers State Hospital caused quite a bit of controversy at the time. Established architect Nathaniel Bradley, who had previously designed the unique train station in North Conway, New Hampshire, and the Boston Young Men's Christian Union building, was hired to design the structure. Critics were quick to decry the richly ornamented Gothic Revival building as unnecessary for a public institution. The hospital's construction budget was overshot, and the completed building leaked in the rain, requiring immediate repairs. Kirkbride hospitals were, like the institutions before them, quickly overcrowded. Part 3. The More Things Change. As early as 1901, just 23 years after Danvers State Hospital was opened, the trustees appealed for more funding as they were housing over 1,000 patients in a complex that should have only held 450. In the 1930s, the hospital's buildings were woefully outdated and many repairs had to be made. In addition, the campus expanded, eventually including the main Kirkbride, 2 buildings for nurses' housing, 2 chapels, a power plant, the aforementioned farm buildings, 2 cemeteries, a water tower, and a small reservoir, among other small structures. Other psychiatric hospital campuses were similar. Connecticut's Norwich State Hospital, founded in 1904, started out with 2 ward buildings. By 1915, the hospital held over 1,000 patients and found itself needing much more space. According to a 1931 insurance appraisal of the property, there were over 100 structures, among them over 20 ward buildings, barns for farm animals, slaughterhouses, a small fire station, and a clubhouse. Norwich State Hospital had deviated from the Kirkbride plan, being laid out on the cottage plan instead. In this arrangement, the institution's wards were separate buildings connected only by a system of tunnels. Nearly every state hospital was interconnected by a labyrinthian system of underground tunnels. These tunnels were mainly used for utility access and patient transport. If an area was experiencing inclement weather, nurses and attendants could move patients from building to building underground for their comfort. Treatments in this era of institutionalization were, by today's standards, horrifically brutal. Insulin shock therapy became popular in the 1930s in order to cure schizophrenia. In this so-called treatment, patients were administered insulin in order to induce a coma, with the coma lasting around an hour. This process was repeated around 30 times, the insulin dosage increasing each time. Doctors reported an improved mental state in patients who underwent insulin shock therapy, but it was not uncommon for patients to suffer negative side effects and even death. Certainly the most infamous so-called treatment of this era was the lobotomy. The precursor to the lobotomy was first performed in 1935 and was popularized a year later by Walter Freeman II. In the late 1940s, the transorbital lobotomy, also known as the ice pick lobotomy, became popular for its efficiency. In this version of the procedure, an ice pick was inserted into a patient's brain above their eye in order to scramble through enough brain tissue to render the patient unintelligible. Freeman toured the nation, performing lobotomies until 1967, when the last recipient of his procedure died of a brain hemorrhage. In vogue at the same time was electroshock therapy. The point of this procedure was to induce a seizure in depressive patients in order to improve their mood. This could be dangerous, with some recipients of electroshock breaking bones during the seizure. Now known as electroconvulsive therapy, or ECT, the shock is paired with an immobilizing agent to prevent injury and is performed much less often. Part 4. Downsized and deinstitutionalized. The downsizing and outright closure of state institutions occurred because of a multitude of factors, among the most important being the development of new antipsychotic medicine and the shifting of public opinion against psychiatry. The first antipsychotic medication, marketed as Thorazine, was brought to market in 1954. Thorazine appeared to make the symptoms of schizophrenia, namely hallucinations, aggressiveness, and paranoia, go away. This and other similar medications were soon widely used by psychiatrists to treat their patients. Antidepressants also made their debut in this era. These advancements meant that patients did not have to be strictly treated in an institutional setting. The advent of these new drugs also resulted in the decline of practices such as insulin shock therapy. Not only this, but the public's confidence in institutionalization was in the metaphorical gutter by the 1970s. Perhaps the biggest blow to trust in psychiatry was David Rosenhan's explosive 1972 study on being sane in insane places. In the study, published in the esteemed Science magazine, Rosenhan claimed that he and 7 other individuals had themselves committed to 12 different psychiatric institutions around the United States on the basis that they were hearing voices. Empty, hollow, thud. All but one were readily committed with the diagnosis of schizophrenia, and these pseudo-patients were released on the condition that their schizophrenia was in remission. None of the pseudo-patients had a history of mental illness, but were diagnosed anyway, and none were unmasked as imposters by hospital staff. The method of this study was very similar to that which journalist Nellie Bly used to gain inside access to the New York City lunatic asylum in 1887. On assignment for the New York World, Bly feigned insanity, or what she thought looked like insanity, and was admitted to the infamous asylum. There she witnessed abuse upon abuse. In her 2 articles on institutionalization, compiled in 10 Days in a Madhouse, Bly related an incident in which some attendants attempted to quiet a patient in distress.
This made the poor creature cry the more, and so they choked her. Yes, actually choked her. After several hours' absence, she returned to the sitting room. I plainly saw the marks on their fingers on her throat for the entire day.
After 10 days, Nellie Bly was able to escape the asylum by means of a correspondent from her newspaper who attested to Bly's sanity. As she rode the ferry back to the city, Bly looked back to the island asylum and reflected upon her luck in walking free.
Poor women. They had no hopes of a speedy delivery. They were being driven to a prison, through no fault of their own, in all probability for life. In comparison, how much easier it would be to walk to the gallows than through this tomb of living horrors.
Bly knew that the vast majority of those she spent time with in the wards would likely never escape the tomb.
I have watched patients stand and gaze longingly towards the city they in all likelihood will never enter again. It means liberty and life. It seems so near, and yet heaven is not further from hell.
Bly's undercover operation and her subsequent articles in the New York World shocked the public. As a result of the articles, admissions guidelines at the asylum were strengthened, and the budget of the Department of Public Charities and Corrections was increased by $850,000. However, both of these measures did not do much to alleviate the suffering within the asylum. Conversely, nearly a century later, David Rosenhan's experiment would effectively close out the era of large psychiatric hospitals. The quick admission of the pseudo-patients and their experiences within the hospitals were deeply troubling to Rosenhan. He was led to the conclusion that modern psychiatry could not differentiate sanity from insanity. This was not a new sentiment, but it was the first time that this idea was backed up with sound data. Sound, perhaps, except for the fact that the vast majority of the study could have been made up. In her 2019 book, The Great Pretender, journalist Susannah Cahalan tried, in vain, to corroborate Rosenhan's data by searching for his pseudo-patients. Other than Rosenhan himself, she could only find one who was a graduate student at the time of the study. Regardless of the validity of the study in retrospect, it shook the psychiatric world to its very core. The 3rd edition of the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, known as DSM-3, was heavily influenced by On Being Sane in Insane Places. The DSM-3 was a major contributing factor in the so-called re-medicalization of psychiatry, a strengthening of diagnostic criteria and an emphasis on reliability. Coupled with these private initiatives, the federal government began to push states to close their hospitals. In 1963, mere months before he was assassinated, President Kennedy signed the Community Mental Health Act. Kennedy summarized the situation in his special message on mental illness and mental retardation.
Nearly half of the 530,000 persons in our state mental hospitals are in institutions with over 3,000 patients, getting little or no individual treatment. Many of these institutions have less than half of the professional staff required. Our chief aim is to get people out of state custodial institutions and back into their communities and homes without hardship or danger.
Kennedy predicted that, within 20 years of the Act's implementation, the population of the nation's psychiatric hospitals would be reduced by 50% or more. The creation of Medicare and Medicaid 2 years later hastened this process. State psychiatric hospitals that had more than 16 beds were not eligible for federal Medicaid money, so states started to close their hospitals. In the late 60s and early 70s, lawsuits started to be filed against institutions on behalf of their abused patients. The hospitals were, by and large, ruled against, and so many of them outright closed. From a high of 558,239 patients in 1955, psychiatric hospitals across the United States had a collective population of only 71,619 by 1994. That's a decrease of 82% over 39 years. The question must be asked, where did all these people go? Some moved to new community facilities. However, these facilities never lived up to the aspirations of the Kennedy administration, and often resembled on a smaller scale the institutions that they were meant to replace. Some were left homeless, on the street or in shelters. Others ended up in prison or in psych wards and general hospitals. Private psychiatric hospitals like McLean Hospital still existed and continue to exist, but are geared toward wealthier clientele. The lack of a strong mental health care network in the United States is painfully evident. It is a complex issue that is inseparable from homelessness, health insurance affordability, and drug addiction. Surely we cannot return to the large warehouse institutions of the past, but the status quo is not the best situation either. Often it seems as if there is no right answer. Part 5. Ruined and Rehabilitated. After the tide of deinstitutionalization emptied state hospitals of their residents and employees, their campuses stood empty. Many were left abandoned for many years, and some continue to sit derelict today, like Norwich State Hospital. Many of its buildings have been demolished, and the rest of the property is, as of recording, being remediated by the town. The property will, within a year from recording, be turned over to the Mohegan tribe to be redeveloped into an entertainment complex to complement the casino across the river. The legendary Danvers State Hospital is now apartments, with the facade of the administration building and 2 wings having been saved from the wrecking ball. The rest of the buildings, save for the power plant, were not as lucky. The hospital's cemetery has been cleaned up, and many of those who rest there have been properly identified and their old numbered gravestones tossed to the side. Medfield State Hospital's buildings sit empty and boarded up, but the campus is open to the public. Dog walkers and families out to enjoy the fresh air walk by the silent red brick buildings, and even squirrels have found a use for the former psychiatric hospital. The campus is soon to be properly redeveloped, with the vast majority of buildings to be restored and used as apartments and artist space. After Vermont State Hospital closed, its buildings were converted for use as state offices. In 2011, the complex was damaged during Hurricane Irene, with some outlying buildings having to be demolished. The main building, thankfully, has been beautifully restored. Metropolitan State Hospital has been mostly redeveloped, with some buildings demolished and others converted into an apartment complex. One building, however, remains abandoned, covered in graffiti, and open to trespassers, such as the maker of this documentary. Other former state hospitals across the nation have met similar fates. New York's Buffalo State Hospital has been partially renovated into an upscale hotel. Weston State Hospital in West Virginia operates as a haunted house and has been featured as a location in the 2018 post-apocalyptic video game Fallout 76. The Greystone Park Psychiatric Hospital in New Jersey and Pennsylvania's Allentown State Hospital have been entirely demolished, despite the fact that their structures were in very good condition and restoration was entirely feasible. The golden era of psychiatric hospitals is long since past. Their buildings transformed, their former patients and staff getting older every day. We see stories of institutions told in movies like One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, which reinforces the negative ideas of state hospitals, and Shutter Island, which uses those ideas only to flip them on their head. We see the struggles of psychiatric hospitals reflected in today's mental health crises. While we have vastly improved in the field of psychiatry, there is still so much left unknown. There are still problems to fix and people to care for. There are lessons to be learned in the history of state hospitals so that we do not see history repeated.